May the 10th, 1974. The ballroom of the Waldorf Astoria Hotel in New York City. A charity gala for the Multiple Sclerosis Society. The kind of event that the New York of 1974 produced in the specific way of an era that was still organized around the formal charity gala as the primary mechanism of both fundraising and social display. The tables at $500 a seat, the women in floor-length dresses, the men in black tie, the specific combination of genuine philanthropic purpose and social theater that such events have always been, and that the people who attend them have always understood themselves to be both participating in genuinely and performing. Joan Crawford arrived at the Waldorf Astoria at 8 in the evening. She was 69 years old, though she had for decades maintained a relationship with the specific number of her age that was more aspirational than documentary. She was wearing a dress that had been chosen with the specific care that Joan Crawford applied to everything she wore in public, which was the care of a woman who had understood since the mid-1920s that her relationship with the public was organized around her appearance, and who had maintained that understanding across 50 years of an industry and a culture whose relationship with aging women was not organized around generosity or patience. She looked extraordinary. This is not the retrospective sentimentality of someone writing about a person who is now gone. The people who were in that ballroom at the Waldorf Astoria on the night of May the 10th, 1974, said so at the time and have said so since, that Joan Crawford looked extraordinary. The dress, the hair, the specific quality of composed, deliberate beauty that she presented to the room was the quality of a woman who had not allowed the decades to remove from her what the decades generally remove. And the room recognized it and responded to it with the specific, admiring response that New York society extends to women who have maintained something extraordinary against the general direction of time. She received the applause. She made the speech. She thanked the organization. She was, for the duration of her appearance at the Waldorf Astoria Gala on the night of May the 10th, 1974, exactly what she had always been in public, which was the total, complete, managed version of Joan Crawford, the version that the public had been receiving since 1924, the version that had been constructed with 50 years of total professional commitment, and that was still, in 1974, being maintained with a level of craft and discipline that the people in the ballroom were appreciating without quite understanding what the appreciation was appreciating. What they were appreciating, in part, was the performance of a woman who was dying, not in the metaphorical sense, not in the sense that aging is a form of dying, which it is and which applies to everyone in the ballroom. In the specific medical sense, Joan Crawford was dying. She had been diagnosed with pancreatic cancer, though the accounts of when the diagnosis was made and whether the specific word pancreatic was the word used vary in ways that I want to be honest about, rather than resolve artificially. What is established is that she had been told, by the people who had examined her, that what was happening in her body was serious and was progressive, and was not going to be stopped by the treatments that were available to her. She did not tell the people in the ballroom. She had not told the people in most of the rooms she had been in since the diagnosis. She had not told the press, which had been documenting her life with the thoroughness of an institution that has been covering someone for 50 years and that has developed, across those 50 years, the specific investment in the continuing story of a famous person that makes the end of the story both inevitable and unwelcome. She had not told, most significantly, the people she had in her life at this point in her life, which were not many people in the sense of close personal relationships of the kind that the word friends in its most specific usage implies. She had the people around her, the staff, the handlers, the specific professional and quasi-professional relationships that a woman of her status and her history and her specific relationship to the people who had been close to her over the decades maintained at this point in her life. She had her relationship with the public, which was as real and as sustaining as any relationship she had, and which had been the most consistent and the most reliable relationship of her life since it began in the mid-1920s. She was not going to tell the public. She was going to die in the specific way she had decided she was going to die, which was as Joan Crawford, which meant in the full performance of Joan Crawford, which meant that the dying was going to happen behind the performance rather than in front of it. Tonight, my friend, I want to take you through the story of what the performance of Joan Crawford dying in silence contained, not from the beginning of the life, but from the end of it, moving backward through the specific public moments of the final years, and showing you, alongside each of them, what was happening in the space behind the public moment that the public moment was organized around not showing. Because the story of Joan Crawford dying in silence is not simply the story of a famous woman with a terminal illness who declined to disclose the illness. It is the story of a woman who had spent 50 years constructing and maintaining the most total and most sustained public performance in the history of American celebrity, and who applied that construction and that maintenance to the final act of her life, with the same completeness and the same professional commitment she had brought to every other act. Because for Joan Crawford, there was no version of herself that existed outside the performance, and therefore no version of the dying that could exist outside it either. The construction of Joan Crawford began in 1924. Lucille LeSueur was born in San Antonio, Texas, on March the 23rd, 1904, though the specific date has been disputed across the decades in the way that specific dates in Joan Crawford's biography have been disputed, which is because Joan Crawford's relationship with the documented facts of her own life was a relationship she managed rather than simply reported. What is known, she was born in Texas. She was born poor in the specific way of the American South's working poor in the early 20th century, and she was born into a family situation that was, by the accounts that have emerged across the decades, more complicated and more painful than the biographical summaries that accompanied her career's public documents tended to suggest. Her father was Thomas LeSueur, who was not present. Not in the dramatic sense of a man who was there and then left, but in the more fundamental sense of a man who was not part of the life from the beginning, in the way that fathers are part of lives when they are part of them. He had gone before the child was old enough to have a memory of his presence. The going was not explained to the child in terms the child could access, because the going was the kind of going that the adults around a child in the early 20th century did not explain to children. In terms children could access, it simply became the background condition of the household, the father-shaped absence that the household organized itself around. Her mother was Annabelle Johnson LeSueur, who remarried. The stepfather was Henry Cassin, and the family for a period used the name Cassin rather than LeSueur. And the child became Billy Cassin before she became Lucille LeSueur, before she became Joan Crawford, which is a sequence of identity that tells you something about the nature of the construction that the name Joan Crawford represents, and about the woman who undertook it. She grew up in Kansas City, Missouri, and in Lawton, Oklahoma, and in the specific geography of the working-class American Midwest and South that produced, in the girls who grew up in it in the first 2 decades of the 20th century, either the quality of settled acceptance or the quality of determined departure. She had the second quality, not in the dramatic sense of a single moment of departure, but in the accumulated sense of a girl who understood from early that the geography she was in was not the geography she was going to remain in, and who directed the resources of her intelligence and her ambition toward the exit rather than toward the accommodation of the current circumstances. She danced. She had been dancing since she was a child, with the specific seriousness of someone for whom dance is not a recreation, but a skill that can be converted into something, into a career, into a departure, into the specific kind of upward mobility that the performance arts offered to girls from backgrounds like hers in the early 20th century, as one of the very few available mechanisms for the conversion of talent into a different life. She arrived in Hollywood in 1924. She had been in vaudeville and in chorus lines and in the specific circuit of theatrical work that the early 1920s offered to young women, with her combination of dancing ability and the specific kind of physical presence that the camera was, in 1924, still in the process of understanding what to do with. She arrived at MGM through a process of notice and screen test and contract that the studio system of 1924 applied to the young women who were arriving in Hollywood in the quantity that the expanding industry required and that the studio was equipped to process. She was renamed. Lucille LeSueur became Joan Crawford through a fan magazine contest organized by MGM, which is both a remarkable and a perfectly logical origin for a name that was to become one of the most recognizable names in American entertainment. Because the fan magazine was the medium through which the relationship between the studios and the public was organized in the 1920s, and because the name Joan Crawford was, from the moment of its selection, a public property rather than a private identity. The gap between Lucille LeSueur and Joan Crawford was established in 1924, and it was, from the beginning, a gap of a different kind than the gaps we have been discussing in other stories. Not the gap of a man managing a private illness or a private grief. The gap between Lucille LeSueur and Joan Crawford was the deliberate construction of a person who understood that the person she was going to present to the world was not the person she had been before the presentation began, and who undertook the construction of the presented person with the total commitment of someone who has decided that the presented person is the person worth being. She learned. This is the thing about Joan Crawford, that the mythology of her, which is organized around the drama and the feuds and the specific quality of excess that the Crawford mythology emphasizes, tends to obscure. She was an extraordinary learner. She came to Hollywood without the formal training that the actors who had come through the theater had, without the specific technical equipment that dramatic education provides, and she acquired what she needed with the discipline and the systematic intelligence of a woman who understood that the gap between where she was and where she needed to be was closable with the right application of sustained effort. She studied acting. She studied the specific technical requirements of the camera. How to move in front of it, how to use the face for the camera rather than for the live audience that the theater requires. The specific adjustments that the difference between the stage and the screen requires of a performer who is making the transition. She studied dancing at a level that went beyond what the chorus line had required, with the seriousness of a performer who is not satisfied with being adequate and who is going to continue until adequate has become something more than adequate. She studied everything that the construction of Joan Crawford required to be studied, and the studying was itself a form of the construction. The construction was not simply the performance, but the acquisition of the ability to perform, the sustained, systematic investment in the craft that the performance required, sustained across decades in a way that the performers who relied on natural gifts without the same investment in craft discovered, over time, was the difference between a career and a moment. The films of the 1920s, the films of the 1930s, the arc of the career in the MGM years is the arc of a woman who arrived as a chorus girl and who became, across the course of the decade, one of the most commercially significant performers on the MGM lot. Not through the trajectory of sudden discovery, but through the specific, sustained accumulation of professional development and commercial success that the decade of consistent, disciplined work produced. She was, by the early 1930s, one of the biggest stars in Hollywood. This required qualification in the specific commercial sense of the era. Not the biggest, not in the terms that the mythology would sometimes suggest, but genuinely among the most commercially reliable and most recognizable, which is its own form of significance. The marriages. She was married 4 times. To Douglas Fairbanks Jr. from 1929 to 1933, to Franchot Tone from 1935 to 1939, to Philip Terry from 1942 to 1946, and to Alfred Steele from 1956 until his death in 1959. The marriages have been written about extensively, and the writing has not always been kind, in the specific way that the writing about Joan Crawford has rarely been kind, organized as it often is around the drama and the excess rather than around the complexity that the marriages contained. She adopted 4 children: Christina in 1940, Christopher in 1943, and the twins Kathy and Cindy in 1947. The adoption of the children and the specific nature of what the children experienced in Joan Crawford's household is the territory that the story of Joan Crawford most directly and most painfully occupies in the public understanding because of what Christina Crawford wrote in Mommy Dearest, the memoir published in 1978 that described the childhood of Christina Crawford in terms that were, if they were accurate, the terms of abuse. I want to be careful about this territory because being careful is what the territory requires. Mommy Dearest is a document that has been contested since its publication by people who knew Joan Crawford and who found Christina's account inconsistent with what they observed, and by people who did not know Joan Crawford and who found the account entirely credible. And the contest has not been resolved in the way that contested accounts are sometimes resolved by the accumulation of additional evidence. What the document is, regardless of the specific factual accuracy of each of its claims, is the account of what it was like to be a child in a household organized around Joan Crawford. And the account has shaped the public understanding of Joan Crawford in ways that the subsequent decades have not dislodged. What I will say is this: the woman who was constructing and maintaining the performance of Joan Crawford across 50 years was constructing and maintaining it in a domestic space that also contained 4 children, and the requirements of the construction and the requirements of the children were not always the same requirements, and the management of that conflict was managed in ways that the children who grew up in the household experienced in the ways that the people who grew up there have described them. She left MGM in 1943. The specific circumstances of the departure were the circumstances of a studio relationship that had run its commercial course. The studio had determined that the specific qualities that Joan Crawford represented were no longer the qualities that the studio's commercial priorities required, and the studio and the actress had arrived through the mechanism of the studio system's specific version of these conclusions. At the end of the formal relationship, she went to Warner Brothers. She was 40 years old. She had been in Hollywood for 19 years. She had been one of the most commercially reliable performers on the most commercially powerful lot in Hollywood for a significant portion of those years. And she was 40 years old, which in the industry of 1944 was an age at which the commercial calculation that studios applied to the women who worked for them produced a specific kind of assessment, which was that the commercial utility of a 40-year-old actress was not the commercial utility of the same actress at 25 or 30. Mildred Pierce came in 1945, and the career that the specific commercial calculus of 1944 suggested was declining, produced from the specific role that she pursued and fought for, and that the studio and the director, Michael Curtiz, were not initially convinced she was the right person to play. One of the finest performances in the history of American cinema, and the Academy Award for Best Actress. She did not go to the ceremony. She was ill, or she said she was ill, and the accounts of whether the illness was genuine and whether the decision not to attend was the decision of a woman who was genuinely unwell, or the decision of a woman who was protecting herself from the specific public risk of being present at the ceremony if she did not win, are the accounts of people who interpreted the same behavior through different lenses and arrived at different conclusions. The Oscar was delivered to her at home. The photographs of Joan Crawford in bed receiving the Oscar with the specific quality of composed, photogenic gratitude that the photographs communicate are among the most iconic images of Hollywood mythology. The years between Mildred Pierce and the final years were the years of the career's second phase, which contained more than the career mythology acknowledges and which was, in its combination of exceptional work and commercial difficulty, and the specific experience of being a woman of a certain age in an industry that had organized its commercial logic around women of a different age, more complicated than either the celebration of Mildred Pierce or the caricature of whatever happened to Baby Jane acknowledges. Whatever happened to Baby Jane came in 1962. She was 58 years old. The film, which she made with Bette Davis, is a horror film about two aging actresses living together in a decaying Hollywood mansion, one of whom is torturing the other. It is also, and this is the dimension of the film that the subsequent decades have been more willing to acknowledge, a film about what Hollywood does to the women who work for it when the women have reached the specific stage of age at which the industry has determined they are no longer commercially useful in the ways the industry prefers to use them. The film uses horror to express something that the industry would not have permitted to be expressed in any other genre. And the expression is both genuine and genuinely disturbing. She was nominated for an Academy Award. She did not win. The Academy Award that year went to Anne Bancroft for The Miracle Worker. Joan Crawford, who had not been nominated, campaigned energetically and publicly against Bette Davis's nomination and arranged to accept Anne Bancroft's award on her behalf if Bancroft, who was performing on Broadway, could not attend. The campaign and the acceptance and the specific quality of the relationship between Joan Crawford and Bette Davis that the Whatever Happened to Baby Jane production produced have been documented and analyzed and mythologized to the point that the mythologization has become its own story, separate from and larger than the specific facts of the relationship. Now, the final years. Let me take you backward through them, through the specific public moments, and show you what was happening on the other side of each one. May the 10th, 1974, the Waldorf Astoria. I started there, and I want to return to it because it is the last documented major public appearance, and because what it represents, the full performance of Joan Crawford at a charity gala while dying, is the distilled essence of what the story of Joan Crawford dying in silence contains. She was at the Waldorf Astoria in May of 1974 in the specific condition of a woman who knows what is happening in her body and who has decided that the public version of herself is not going to reflect what is happening in her body, because the public version of herself has never reflected the private reality of herself and is not going to begin doing so because the private reality has become terminal. The diagnosis, whatever the specific medical terminology was, whether pancreatic cancer was the word that was used, or whether the word was different and the pancreatic cancer determination was the retrospective assessment of what the symptoms described, was in the background of the Waldorf Astoria Gala in May of 1974, in the specific way that a terminal diagnosis is in the background of everything that a person who has a terminal diagnosis does. She was in pain. The pain of pancreatic cancer is specific and it is serious, and it is the kind of pain that the people who experience it describe in terms that do not allow for minimization. She was managing the pain. She was managing it with whatever the management of that kind of pain in 1974 involved, and she was managing it in the way she had managed everything that she did not intend for the public to see, which was in the private space behind the performance. She made a speech at the Waldorf Astoria. She thanked the Multiple Sclerosis Society. She looked extraordinary. She received the applause. She went home. December the 15th, 1973. The New York Times published a profile of Joan Crawford, written by a journalist who had spent several hours with her in her apartment on the Upper East Side of Manhattan. The apartment that was, by this point in her life, her primary residence and the specific geography of the final chapter of a life that had been, across its length, organized around a succession of residences that were themselves statements of the specific position Joan Crawford occupied at each stage of the career. The journalist described a woman of remarkable composure and remarkable organization. The apartment was immaculate, in the specific way that the accounts of Joan Crawford's domestic arrangements consistently describe as characteristic. Not simply tidy, but organized, with the precision of a person for whom the management of the visible environment was itself a form of performance, and for whom a disordered visible environment was not an acceptable background against which to present the performance. She was, in the December 1973 interview with the New York Times, the version of herself she was always in interviews, which was the version of herself that interviews were designed to produce, the specific, managed presentation of Joan Crawford that she had been developing and refining since the fan magazine profiles of the late 1920s, and that she had long since perfected to the degree that the performance of Joan Crawford in an interview was indistinguishable from the genuine Joan Crawford in any way that a journalist could identify. Behind the interview, behind the immaculate apartment, and the composed manner and the specific quality of total professional control that the journalist observed and wrote about, was the body. The body that was, by December of 1973, in the condition that it was in. The body that contained what it contained. The body that the performance of Joan Crawford was organized around not acknowledging. She gave the interview. The profile ran. The New York Times readers received the version of Joan Crawford that the interview had produced. The specific condition of the body was not in the profile. June 2nd, 1972. The publication of My Way of Life, the book that Joan Crawford wrote, or that was written under her name, since the collaborative nature of celebrity memoir writing in this period was such that the name on the cover and the hand doing the primary writing were not always the same hand. About the specific approach to life and work and the management of the self that had produced the career and the person who had the career. The book was a book about control, about the management of the appearance, the management of the domestic environment, the management of the professional relationships and the social relationships, and the specific daily practices that the management of Joan Crawford required. It was, in its specific subject matter and its specific approach to that subject matter, one of the most honest things Joan Crawford ever produced about herself. Not because it disclosed the things she was not disclosing. It did not. But because it was honest about the specific nature of the project of being Joan Crawford, which was a project of total management, of the conversion of every aspect of a life into the material of a sustained, comprehensive performance. She was writing about control while the thing she could not control was happening. The body does not respond to the management principles that Joan Crawford's book described. The body does not respond to the organization of the domestic environment or to the specific daily practices of the woman who had been managing her public presentation since 1924. The body has its own processes and its own calendar and its own specific indifference to the will of the person inhabiting it, and the specific process that was happening in Joan Crawford's body in the period of the book's writing and publication was happening on a calendar, and according to processes that the management principles the book described were not equipped to address. She published the book. The book was received with the specific quality of interest that the publications of famous people receive, not the universal critical acclaim that the author might have preferred, but the engagement and the discussion that the name Joan Crawford on the cover of a book about how to live and manage and present oneself was guaranteed to produce. The specific condition of the body was not in the book. Let me now go further back, before the illness is documented, to the years that produced the specific quality of alone that the final years contained. Because the dying in silence is not only the silence about the illness. The dying in silence is also the silence of the specific aloneness of Joan Crawford's final years the specific way in which the life that had been constructed around the performance of Joan Crawford had, by the early 1970s, produced a version of the life that contained the performance and very little else. Alfred Steele, the fourth and final husband, died in 1959. He had been the president of Pepsi-Cola, and the marriage to him had been the marriage that most directly connected Joan Crawford to a world outside Hollywood, the world of corporate America, of board meetings and executive functions, and the specific social geography of the business world in the late 1950s. She had been, in the years of the marriage to Steele, the most public wife of a corporate executive in America, appearing at Pepsi-Cola events with the total professional commitment she brought to everything, and serving as a form of living advertisement for the brand that the brand found valuable and that she engaged with as a professional rather than as a dilettante. Steele died of a heart attack in April of 1959. He died in the New York apartment, leaving Joan Crawford in the specific situation of a woman who has been widowed for the fourth time and who is 55 years old and who is, in the years following the death, in the process of determining what the next form of the life is going to be. The Pepsi-Cola board asked her to remain on the board. She remained on the board, and she continued to be the public presence for the brand that she had been during the marriage, traveling and appearing and giving the specific quality of total professional commitment that she brought to the Pepsi-Cola work in the way she brought it to everything. She was, in the early 1960s, one of the most recognizable corporate spokespersons in America, which is its own form of extraordinary given that the person doing the spokesperson work was a woman who was in her late 50s and who had been a film star for 30 years. The board eventually asked her to step down. The specific reasons given for the request were the reasons that boards give when they have decided that a person's continued association with the brand is no longer serving the brand's purposes, which are reasons that the person receiving them tends to experience as the specific form of rejection that is most painful because it comes from the institution rather than from an individual. She stepped down. The step was managed publicly, with the composure she brought to the management of everything that was publicly painful. The specific experience of the step was not publicly available. She lived in New York in the final years. The apartment on the Upper East Side, the staff that managed the apartment with the specific standards she required, the correspondence, which she maintained with the discipline of a woman for whom the management of the relationship with the public, even in its most individual form, the letter to the fan, was a professional rather than a personal act, or rather was both, in the way that Joan Crawford's professional life and personal life had never been entirely separable. She had the Christian Science faith, to which she had converted at some point in the earlier decades of her life, and which was the framework through which she understood and managed the specific experience of her own body's condition in ways that were, in the specific context of a terminal illness, both sustaining and complicated. The Christian Science approach to illness and to the body's condition is organized around a framework that does not center the medical management of physical symptoms in the way that the medical establishment of the 1970s centered it. And the specific application of that framework to the specific condition that Joan Crawford was experiencing in the early 1970s was part of what the silence about the illness contained. She did not pursue aggressive medical treatment. This is established across multiple accounts of the final years. She did not pursue the specific interventions that the oncology of 1974 would have offered as responses to the kind of cancer she had, and the reasons she did not pursue them were, by the accounts of the people who knew her in those years, multiple rather than singular. The faith, the specific philosophy about the body and its condition that the faith produced, and the additional reason that is harder to name, but that is present in the accounts of people who understood what she was doing. She was not going to die as a patient. She was not going to die in the managed, medicalized way of a person who has entered the machinery of oncological treatment and who is living in the final period of their life in the context of that machinery. She was going to die as Joan Crawford, which meant in the full performance of Joan Crawford, which meant that the dying was going to be organized around the performance rather than around the treatment that the dying would have interrupted. She died on May the 10th, 1977, exactly 3 years after the Waldorf Astoria gala. She was 72 years old, or 73, depending on which of the conflicting accounts of her birth year the account you are reading accepts. She died in the apartment on the Upper East Side of Manhattan in the morning in the company of her housekeeper. The cause of death was recorded as acute myocardial infarction, a heart attack. Whether this was the primary cause or whether the cancer, which had been progressing through the years of the silence, was the underlying condition that the heart attack was the acute expression of, is not something the death certificate resolves and is not something the available accounts resolve with the certainty of a fully documented medical history. She had given instructions that there was to be no funeral service, no public ceremony, no gathering at which the public performance of Joan Crawford would be required one final time of the people who loved her or who had been in her life. This is the instruction that I find the most revealing thing about what the dying in silence meant to her. More revealing than the silence about the diagnosis. More revealing than the decision not to pursue medical treatment. She did not want a funeral. She did not want the public ritual of mourning that a figure of her public significance would have generated. She did not want the specific form of public attention that death produces in the lives of famous people. She had organized her entire public life around the management of public attention, around the direction of what the public received from her, and the withholding of what the public was not going to receive. And, in the final instruction, she extended that management to the event of her own death. The public was not going to receive a performance of Joan Crawford mourned. There was not going to be a performance. There was not going to be a stage for the performance. She was cremated. Her ashes were interred in a mausoleum at Ferncliff Cemetery in Hartsdale, New York, alongside the ashes of Alfred Steele. Mommy Dearest was published in 1978. Christina Crawford's account of her childhood appeared 1 year after her mother's death, in the specific timing that the timing was. The book was a publishing phenomenon. It sold enormously. It entered the culture in the way that books about famous people that reveal what the private version of the famous person contained enter the culture when what they reveal is sufficiently dramatic to produce the specific cultural response that Mommy Dearest produced. The response to Mommy Dearest has occupied a significant portion of the subsequent cultural attention to Joan Crawford, and I do not intend to take up that ground again here, because the ground has been occupied extensively, and because the story I have been telling tonight is not primarily the Mommy Dearest story, but the story of the dying in silence, and what the silence contained, and what the silence cost, and what the silence was for. What the silence was for. This is the question I want to end with, because the question of what the silence was for is the question that reveals most clearly who Joan Crawford was and what the construction of Joan Crawford across 50 years had produced in the woman who had been constructing it. The silence was for Joan Crawford, not for the management of public perception in the ordinary sense of a celebrity protecting an image. The silence was the expression of the most fundamental commitment of Joan Crawford's entire public life, which was the commitment to the proposition that the Joan Crawford who existed in the public space was the Joan Crawford that mattered, and that the space behind the performance, the space where Lucille LeSueur still existed, where the illness existed, where the specific private experience of a dying woman existed, was not the world's property, and was not going to be made the world's property, not even at the end. She had been making that argument for 50 years. She had been making it with the most sustained and most total performance in the history of American celebrity, organized around the proposition that the public version and the private version were different, and that the private version was hers. She made the argument with the dying the way she had made it with everything else. Completely professionally, without the partial disclosure that would have allowed the public to assemble the full picture from the pieces. She died as Joan Crawford, not as Lucille LeSueur, not as the woman who was in the body that the cancer was progressing through, not as the woman who was in pain and who was dying in the specific, unperformable way of dying. As Joan Crawford, the performance held, the gap held, the silence held, until May the 10th, 1977, when it stopped holding. Not because the illness was disclosed, but because Joan Crawford was gone. And Joan Crawford being gone meant that the performance was over. And the performance being over meant that the gap was gone. And the gap being gone meant that the thing the gap had contained for 50 years was, for the first time, not behind the performance, but simply there. Lucille LeSueur, the girl from San Antonio, the girl who arrived in Hollywood in 1924 and who became Joan Crawford and who maintained the becoming for 50 years across every form of professional difficulty and personal loss and physical diminishment, that 50 years of a life that made every claim the life made of her. She made it look like Joan Crawford. She made it look like Joan Crawford until the morning of May the 10th, 1977, when there was nobody in the apartment on the Upper East Side to make it look like anything. She had been dying in silence. The silence was the performance. The performance was the life. And the life was, in the end, exactly what she had decided it was going to be when she arrived in Hollywood in 1924, with nothing except the decision to construct the person she had decided was worth being. She constructed her. She maintained the construction. She died as the construction. That is who Joan Crawford was. Sleep well, my friend. And the next time you see that face, in Mildred Pierce, in Whatever Happened to Baby Jane, in any of the 50 years of films, see what the face is maintaining. See the specific quality of total, complete, professional self-possession that the face communicates in every frame of every film in which it appears. You are looking at the performance of a life. The performance held until the morning of May the 10th, 1977. Then it ended. And what was left when it ended was whatever was behind it, which she never showed us, which was hers, which she kept,